Hey everybody, this is Will, and in this video I'm going to take you through my mindset, my workflow, my process, and the reason why I use sends and returns for audio routing live on stage. And in fact, I think if you can get this, you're going to have the most flexible and efficient setup for running tracks when it comes to audio outputs possible. Now, I just wrapped up a series where I introduced publicly, I think maybe for the first time, a concept I call the three-part framework for using tracks. I've been teaching this for the past 3 years at From Studio to Stage, and it's something I kind of discovered from years and years of running tracks on stage and needing to find a way that gives me freedom and flexibility, but is efficient. It doesn't take me hours to program sets and build sets, but is also very stable. And as I did these videos, a few of you reached out and asked some really good questions. For example, here's 3 I pulled out. Someone said, when connecting your interface to a mixer, say at a live event, do you need 2 TRS cables to plug into the mixer and interface, or do you need more since you have more output? Someone else said, can I ask, when playing in a live situation with say 8 separate outputs going to the sound guy, how would you normally route each output? And then finally, I asked specifically for feedback if any of you were interested in understanding this audio sends and returns setup that I specifically have developed over the past few years. And in particular, someone said, since you asked in the video, yes, I would love to know about your current setup for the sends and returns. You mentioned you use 12 output channels. Does that mean you typically use 6 return tracks in a live situation? So that's what we're going to do today. I've got a couple notes here that I'm going to go through, but this is really going to be more kind of stream of consciousness. I'll go back through and add timestamps afterwards. So please don't, moan at me and complain if you feel like this video rattles on. This is kind of meant to be just a thought, a look at how I approach this and why I do this. And again, this is something I've developed after using Ableton Live and running tracks on stage for a very long time. And it comes down to a couple goals. I did make a couple notes, so I made sure I remember to say this. One for me, a core principle of how I format tracks, how I build sets, is freedom and flexibility. The freedom and flexibility to change my arrangement, which is why I warp tracks. The freedom and flexibility to repeat in my song, which is why I add locators and why I warp tracks. But even with audio routing, the freedom and flexibility to have an Ableton Live set and quickly go from a 12 output setup, say with a Play Audio 12, to a 2 output setup, where I'm just doing click and guide on one side and tracks on the other. And I want to do that like instantly. I don't want to have to go back through and make decisions about my outputs and all that. The other goal for me is I need to be able to send separate tracks out of separate outputs. Now, this depends on the gig. This depends on the setup. I'm going to show you a song we've been working with. I've been going through kind of a series specifically with worship leaders on how to format different songs. I just pulled up a song that we just really recently did, where I'm going to show you how I am routing things there. But sometimes, and then I'll show you another example where I did a live album recording where we sent based on a separate output, then we sent the rest of our tracks separate than the instrument, separate instrument setups. But I need a way to have multiple outputs so that I could say send a bass discreetly, so that we could turn that up and send that just to the subs. A way to send pads separately from my tracks, which is separately from my percussion elements. I need a way to do multiple outputs, but I also need a way to manage my song volumes really easily. So doing multiple outputs, but still adjusting song volume really easily is super important. Another thing for me that's important, I want to be able to just step on stage, open my computer, open my Ableton Live Set, plug in my interface and go. Particularly for me, maybe you're into this, I have no interest in stepping on stage and every time I open my computer spending 5 minutes routing my outputs for my my setup, and rerouting things every time I add a new song to that. I don't want to do that on stage. That's pre-work to me. That's stuff you got to do before you even step on stage, is routing outputs. And so I want to do that there. The other thing for me that's super important is I want to be able to make a decision about what track this track from this song, what output that goes to, or how I'm going to route that for that particular song. And I want to do that once. I don't want to every time I use the song. And I see a lot of people that another concept I teach, and again, this is going to be kind of stream of consciousness all over the place. So take from it what you can, and we'll go from there. But one of the concepts I teach is manage sets, not stems. Manage sets, not stems. And one of the reasons I see people do that is I see them over in their browser, open up a set of stems. So something that would look, a little bit like this, and they're just dragging in stems. And every time they go to do that song, they re-drag their stems in, and then they reset their tempo, they re-add their locators, and they reroute their audio every single time. And that's fun for a while, but you're going to start to hate that when it takes you 2 hours to build an Ableton Live set. If you apply what I call the 3-part framework for using tracks, you can build an Ableton Live set of, it doesn't matter how many songs, in 5 minutes, right? That you're using with tracks on stage. I know I've been mentioning this, so let's talk about the 3-part framework, and then we'll really dive into the sends and returns process. And again, those of you that are like, get to the point, you're not going to like this video, so just go ahead and shut it off. I promise you that, because we're going to be kind of all over the place showing you stuff, because this is less of a tutorial and more of a like, how does Will's crazy brain work and why does it work this way? 3-part framework for using tracks. Number one, we've talked about this, work from a template. In my template in particular, well, actually, let me open this up and I'll show you this. Okay. So first thing I will mention, if you want this template to follow along, head to fromstudiotostage.com/free. fromstudiotostage.com/free, and you can get this free tracks template. So first step of the 3-part framework for using tracks is work from a template. And what you want to do in that template is add return tracks. Okay. So in the free tracks template, I've got 4 return tracks. Honestly, you could download this and you could add all 12 return tracks if you wanted to. Ableton maxes out at 12 return tracks. So if you wanted to, you could go up here and say create and insert a return track. And let's max this out just for the fun of this if I want to. Okay. So first thing I do though is I need to go in and I need to insert my return tracks and add those into my template. And it's super important. Okay. So there's all 12 of those guys that we've got loaded in. It's super important though, that when we add our return tracks to our template, that we figure out how many return tracks we're going to need. And then we're going to add the same amount of return tracks to our songs. You'll see why in just a second. But in my template itself, I'm going to add my return tracks. And here's an important concept that I think is super, super helpful here. This is where someone was asking, they said, since you asked about in your video, I'd love to know about your current setup for sends and returns. You mentioned you use 12 outputs. So does that mean you typically use 6 return tracks in a live situation? That's a good guess, but I want to break a common misconception people have when I start talking about sends and returns and understanding this. And here's the rule I want you to understand. Return tracks do not equal outputs. Okay. Return tracks do not equal outputs. And here's what I mean by that. So I added all 12 of my possible return tracks to my Ableton Live set. Okay. That does not mean this set needs 12 outputs. A return track could be a mono or a stereo output. So technically with 12 outputs here, I could have a 24 outputs setup, right? So I can make this a stereo output here, external out. And if I had enough outputs, this could be 23, 24, right? If I was using, say DVS for Dante or something, and I had up to 64 outputs using DVS, then I could do 24 outputs using return tracks. But return tracks do not equal outputs. Here's how I want you to think about return tracks. Here's how I think about return tracks, and you'll see why in a second. Bear with me. Return tracks are groupings, okay? Return tracks are common groupings of sounds, of instruments, and types of things. So here's how I would typically think about this. I would approach this. Let me get back to our just normal 4 return tracks that come in the free tracks template. And I would think about the particular artist I'm working with, the particular church I'm serving at, the band that you're subbing in for, whatever it is. Whatever your scenario is, think about their catalog of content, think about their particular band setup, and say, what are the typical kind of groupings that are involved in that type of music? So for you, maybe you're going to run drums live, like your drums are recorded into the tracks and your stems. And so you're like, okay, I want to have drums here. I want to group my bass stuff together. Maybe there's no guitar stuff. All guitar stuff is live. So there's my keys stuff. And then maybe there's some percussion stuff. Okay. That's something potentially you might think about. It may be a little different for you. You may have keys things. You may have guitar stuff in there. You may have vocals tracked. You may have background vocals. Whatever it is, just kind of think, generally speaking, how you would separate that. I want to make this easier for you and easier to think of kind of groupings and pairings and how you would particularly route outputs. So in order to do that, I put together a free little, it's simple, but it's a free little PDF that's going to help you. I'm going to give some suggestions of, here's some example audio routings that you could use if you have 2 outputs, if you have 4, if you have 6, if you have 8, you have 12, 24, whatever it is, based on your particular setup. And if you want that, you can head to fromstudiostage.com/outputs. From studiostage.com/outputs. And that's, again, you could just download this free PDF where I offer some suggestions on how to group those types of sounds. Okay. So another example for this is, let's say you're thinking about all your different content. You've got 4 return tracks here, and you say, maybe this is tracks. This is where my tracks content's going to be. Maybe we got some keys content. We've got some percussion content. I try to keep anything that is a different frequency separated, or maybe something that's like, a sub bass or something, right? So let's say this is our sub bass stuff. Okay. So first thing I do is in my template, I make sure I add the amount of return tracks I need for that. Now, I admit I've kind of changed. When I first started this approach, I thought return tracks equal outputs, but I have kind of shifted to thinking of return tracks more for groupings, and then we can change the outputs from there. So the approach I personally have started to take, you will not see this in the free template because the free template has 4 return tracks, is I add all 12 return tracks to start with. Now, those groupings shift a little bit based on what I have, but those are kind of my normal groupings. The other thing I should mention here in our template is I do not send my click. I do not send my guide. And if I were to have LTC or time code, something like that, in my set, then that's not going to a return track. So if I had 12 return tracks, I could do 12 mono outs. I could do 24 stereo outs. But on top of that, if I had enough outputs, we're back to that Dante scenario where we have 64 outputs, whatever it is, however many you want to do. Then I could go beyond that and say, I have 24 stereo outs, but I also then have, 12 stereo outs. I have 12 stereo outs, so 24 total outputs, but then I want to do click, which is 25. And then I want to do guide, which is 26. And then I want to do LTC, which is 27, right? And I could have 27 outputs. Now, I particularly have no interest in running a gig or running playback for a show that has 27 outputs, but I know some people that do. And based on the show, that's great. That's fantastic. So you could do that, and you could separate, use my return tracks and then also use your outputs there. So I do want to mention that and this is another thing I've changed. I used to route all my click, guide, that sort of stuff to a like click and guide return track, but now that's a direct routing. The way I do that is audio out, external out, 1, and send all these to typically channel 1. And then I have my return tracks. Okay. So that's step 1, 3-part framework. I work from a template. I add my return tracks. I do my groupings there. Okay. That's kind of the default thing. So then I'm going to just customize this template a little so I don't save over it. And we're going to throw this in our templates thing here too. And we'll say, we'll call this return track demo. Okay, and let's save this in this folder. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is pull up my songs. And so I'm going to go to a song that we just did. And again, this is a song that I did from this series, doing this for worship leaders. And within this particular song, I need to make sure I have the same amount of return tracks in my song that I have in my template. Now, in a perfect world, those groupings should be saved. Actually, not in a perfect world. Like if you really want this to work, you have to have the same number of return tracks, but you have to think about your groupings in the same way. So you can't change your type of groupings per song. Here's what I mean by that. If I decide in my template that return track A is vocals, then in my song, return track A is vocals, right? If I decide in my template return track B is guitar, then return track B is guitar. C, aux, right? So typically what I do with my song is I open up, add my return tracks. Pro tip, you could also open up just a default live set, add your return tracks, and then go up to file and do save live set as template, and have like a 4 return track template or whatever, just to save yourself some time. But within my song, I add my return tracks. I then take all of my stems and I group all of my stems. So I've taken all these stems and I've grouped them. And again, if you're going, Will, you're not showing us how to do this. I've done all this in the previous videos. This is just kind of a me recapping what I do, right? And I should have mentioned this at the beginning. This is also not a basic intro tutorial on how to connect Ableton Live to your soundboard. This is again, a deep dive into how I treat sends and returns and why I particularly use them in a live scenario. So all my stems are grouped here. The benefit of that is within these stems, I've gone in and said, okay, so let's send our drums here to D. because I've said that that aux is going to be, or that return track is the aux track. So anything that doesn't make sense being a vocal, guitar, or keys in the context of this is going to go to aux. I always try to mention this in these. Please do not watch this tutorial and go and say, hey, we'll dog it. Ableton Live certified trainer said that I have to have 4 return tracks and they should be vocals, guitar, keys, and aux. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just throwing this out as an example. Again, if you want a suggestion on what your groupings should be and what your output should be, head to FromStudioStage.com/outputs, right? And you can download that free PDF. So looking back at this song, I've gone through each one of my tracks. I have routed to a return track by turning up the send knob. I've grouped them, and grouping them, again, if you remember, one of the key things I'm heading into this to try to do is I want to make it to where I can I can manage volumes of each individual song really easily. So one of the ways I do that is I have this group track. On audio 2, I make sure that's set to sends only. That way I can adjust the overall volume of the level of my song. So if it's too loud, I bring it down. If it's too quiet, I bring it up. But the cool thing about this is we still have those send knobs turned up to return tracks. So what that means is I can turn down the full song, but each of these tracks are still going to go to these separate return tracks. From here, once we get into our template, then we can talk about how to route those return tracks, particularly to outputs. Okay, if that makes sense to you. So again, return tracks do not equal outputs. At this point, I'm not thinking about, am I running, if we have 4 return tracks, am I running 4 stereo pairs? Am I running 4 mono outputs? What am I doing? I'm not thinking about that right now. I'm just thinking about, here's my groupings, here's my pairings. Okay. So we've got our song, it's grouped. We've sent tracks to our return tracks, and there's our return tracks. So step 2 of the 3-part framework for using tracks is we want to take our template that we created in the beginning. Again, that template has our audio routing. Beyond that, it has MIDI routing. It has some track formatting stuff. We're going to take that template, format all of our songs exactly the same way. In particular, in this case, as it pertains to audio routing, sends and returns, we're going to make sure that we make decisions in that song, looking at it for the first time, or looking at it only one time. We only want to have to do this once. We want to say this track goes to this return track. This track goes to this return track. And I've made that decision in the song using my template. So I've formatted my song using my template, and I've got my return tracks ready to go. Now, when it comes time to build my set, this is what I can do. I can go and open my template. So here's part 3 of our 3-part framework for using tracks is we open our setup and we say, okay, song 1. So there's locator 1, song 1. We're going to go to songs. We're going to take this. We're going to drop our live set in. Okay. I've dropped this into my Ableton Live Set. The one thing I'm going to do here, just to change this a little bit differently from how this loaded in, is I take this content, I go up here, click 1, I paste, and that drops right in exactly where I need it to go. Okay. Now what's cool about this, again, another one of my goals is, I want to do the pre-work of deciding, where my return tracks go, where my outputs go, whatever. I want to do that before I step on stage. So, what's really cool about this is let's expand this track out. Let's go over to session view, because I think it's just a little easier to see. Let's go to session view here, and you'll see 808 goes to return track D. Electric guitar goes to return track B. I did all that work before. I'm not figuring this out when I'm on stage. I'm simply just loading my song in, and it's going to all my return tracks, right? And it's doing that because I used the same template to format it before. So now what's cool about this, again, if you remember, I said return tracks do not equal output. So looking at this, how many outputs do you think I'm using for this scenario? Give everybody a second. In fact, if you want to guess, you can guess in the comments below, and we'll pick back up. So how many outputs do you think I'm using in this particular setup? Now, here's the thing. I don't necessarily know. Now, if you look, you can see I open my template and I use my template to format my songs, and I open my template to build my set. And if you actually look at my return tracks over here, you'll see that I have outputs 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, 7 and 8. I don't have my interface connected yet to my computer. I've got click as 1 and 1 here, and that's fine. I would actually have to separate these out and, make this 1 and make this 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? Because I don't want click going down my tracks. But I've pre-made this decision about my interface. So here's what's cool about this. I go to Command comma, which is preferences, go to the audio tab. Now I can choose my play audio 12. And I should have already, gone into output and I've set up my stereo outputs. I've just enabled those. Okay, and I go out of here. And what's really cool about this is as soon as I selected my audio interface, you'll see all these outputs for these tracks popped on and they're ready to go, right? They're pre-routed to 1 through 8, right? I stepped on stage, I plugged in my interface, I selected it in Ableton Live's preferences, and my return tracks are all automatically routed to outputs on my interface, okay? But again, you're going, Will, you said return tracks do not equal outputs, right? I mentioned that at the beginning, and you're going, you've got 4 return tracks and you've got 4 stereo pairs. So you're kind of lying here. Well, no, I'm not lying. This is my kind of setup right now, but here's the reason I use return tracks for this. Let's say for some reason our setup needs to change. We no longer have 8 outputs. We only have 4 outputs. Then in my set that's built, I can go in and do this. External out 1, external out 2. We need to re-enable some, give ourselves some more mono outputs here. So we're going to enable those guys. Okay. And let's make this 3. And then let's make this 4. Those of you that have done this before and have lived the life of having to go in and reroute all your outputs and your stems as you change your number of outputs know the beauty of this setup. So I just went into return tracks and I changed this to be a 4 output setup instead of an 8 output setup. But guess what? I don't have to do anything to my songs. My songs are still going to stay the same. Everything's going to stay exactly the same. I still have those groupings, but now I'm at a 4 output setup as opposed to an 8 output setup. Okay. Well, let's take it even further though. Let's say that this is like a festival gig. We've got 20 minutes to do, 3 to 4 song set. We've got 5-minute sound check, if even that. And if you show up to the festival, unless you're the headliner and say, hey, I need to send 8 outputs of tracks, they're looking at you and going, you're crazy, man. You get 2 outputs, click and guide or click and tracks. That's all you get. You're on the bus on the way there. You're in the van on the way there. And you're going, man, I got to rebuild my entire set. We're set up for 8 outputs. No, you don't. Watch how simple this is. I go to all of these. We're doing a 2 output setup now. I set external out to output 2. Again, I know this isn't a perfect example because I've left my click and guide on 1 the whole time and tracks are also on 1. But in this scenario, it actually works out. Click and guide are already on 1, which is great. Now tracks are on 2, keys are on 2, percussion's on 2, and sub bass is on 2. Okay. So the beauty of this setup is, I didn't touch my songs. I still have my song volume here, and I'll show you this in the context of a full set here in just a moment. I haven't touched my song volume yet, my level for my song. I still have all my return tracks, and I just changed those outputs to outputs 2, right? So I got a 2 output setup. Now I went from 8 to 4 to 2. Now let's say we are done with the festival. We decide to make a quick stop to do this club date. We're back to 8 outputs, as you probably imagine. I just go back to this setup, and let's actually do this right. We did click and guide on 1. So let's actually do this the way we should have in the beginning. We're going to do external out 3 and 4, external out 5 and 6, external out 7, 8, external out 9 and 10. What's great about this now is now I'm doing a 10 output setup from Ableton Live. Click and guide are outputs 1. I can make this output 2 if I wanted to. Some of you may be going, well, separate your guide. You got that second output. Sure. Let's do click on 1, guide on 2, tracks 3 and 4, keys 5 and 6, percussion 7 and 8, and sub bass is 9 and 10. Don't send sub bass down a stereo output, and don't comment and fuss at me and say I'm sending sub bass out of 9 and 10. You get the point. So the benefit of this, the main reason I use sends and returns live is flexibility. I want to make decisions about my song beforehand so that I just build my set and all my outputs are already routed. I still have the ability to have multiple outputs. I still have the ability, even greater ability, to adjust and manage song volumes. And I'll show you that in a second in the context of a full set with songs. And again, back to freedom and flexibility. I have the flexibility to change outputs in my set, and I don't have to go into my song and change all my outputs. I know a lot of folks that have a setup to where they would basically say, let's create electric guitar. And this is my guitar track. And then they drag all their guitars into this electric guitar track and then send external to, external out and send that to, whatever it would be here. Let's say the guitar is 4. Well, as soon as I go from a 8 output setup to 2 output setup, guess what they're doing? They're going to guitar track, then the bass track, then the drums track, and changing that to 2, and changing all the other stuff. And this setup, I just change it once at the template level for that specific setup, and I'm good to go. So now with that, let me open up this live set here. And this has, this is maybe a little more practical scenario to show you, because it's a full song, a full set that's built with multiple songs. And you see kind of what this looks like. So each one of these songs is grouped together, these stems, they're all going to sends only. I get individual song levels. So you can see like this song, I guess this intro drone was super hot. These all were just at 0. So I just kind of leveled these out. Then if I go into my return tracks, in this particular setup, we were doing clicking guide out of 1, bass tracks out of 2. So see, I promise I know what I'm doing. I didn't send bass to a stereo output. Tracks were left and right. And then instruments, which is just everything other than bass stuff, other than clicking guide, and other than what we would consider like a drum loop, synthy loop kind of thing, is all in instruments, and that's 5, 6. Okay, so I'm doing a 6 output setup here, and this particular setup with these return tracks. Another thing I like about return tracks, I was reminded about this as an added side benefit when I was prepping for this video, which is basically opening these files and making sure they loaded fine. As you can tell by the fact we're 25 minutes into this exploration of sends and returns, is I love I can do this. I have all my outputs set here. I click this R button and boom, those outputs go away, and I don't have to look at them, because there's no reason for me, no need for me to continually be looking at all the outputs that are in my set. I don't need to see those. And so what's cool again about this is I go to each song now though and go, okay, I need a little less of this. I need a little more of this. I need that. And if I really need to, I could go into this song and say, you know, you could see I've got a few things muted here. I could go in and adjust the level. You can see this keys part's a little quieter. That's a little quieter than everything else. This is up a little bit. You know, I could just go in and change things and then group that back up, fold it back up, and everything's good to go there. So that's a not so brief deep dive into why I use sends and returns live. I think some of the benefits, again, recapping: freedom and flexibility, the ability to route audio for a song once, the ability to have multiple outputs, plug into my interface on stage and basically go, and then the ability to manage song volume really easily between songs, and adjusting my levels are just a few of the benefits of using sends and returns. As a reminder, if you want to download the free track template to follow along to format your content, again, completely free. It's named incredibly well because it's a free tracks template that is free. Then head to FromStudioToStage.com/template. It's where you can grab that. And then again, as a reminder, if you want a suggestion on how do I do my groupings, if I've got 4 return tracks, if I've got 8, if I've got 12, and then, you know, based on those groupings, then how do I then route those to outputs? Then head to FromStudioToStage.com/outputs. And that's a very niche, free download, but head to FromStudioToStage.com/outputs. You'll download that PDF. And again, I give you my suggestions on groupings, and then depending on your output count, how you could potentially group, route those particular groupings. So with that, we're done. Keep the questions coming. Again, this is not a intro basic how to plug in your interface, how to connect your interface to the soundboard. We will do that. That's on the list, and we're coming there, and we'll cover all of that stuff. And we'll dive into that, and I'll share some bits and pieces from our audio routing for live performance course, maybe even. But if you have any other questions about the sends and returns process, or really anything about my tracks process, leave a comment below. Again, if you want to see me explain the template, you want to see me use the template to format songs and then take those songs and build a set, check out all the links I added in the description of this. I dive into that very, very extensively. And then obviously from there, you could check out all the courses we have on From Studio Stage, where I go even deeper. If you can imagine the ability to go deeper on this, it's possible. And we do there. So anyway, thanks so much for watching this one. Join me next week, 10 a.m. Central. We'll continue talking about using tracks live on stage. And again, doing it in a way, our goal is to do it in a way that's gives us freedom and flexibility, but it's efficient, and in a way that keeps our Ableton set very, very stable. So thanks for watching. We'll see you next week, 10 a.m. Central. Take care, everybody. Bye.